Welcome, everybody. I'm Nick Aster. I'm the founder and publisher of TriplePundit.com. We have partnered with Presidio Graduate School to put together an interesting series of interviews with alums from the Presidio Graduate School. This is our first episode, and we are really excited to be joined by David Groves, who had one of the more interesting careers post-Presidio that I'm aware of. He was a senior policy advisor in the Obama White House. And David, welcome and thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much.
David, give us a little, let's just jump right into it. What is this, what was this role that you managed to achieve at the White House, and exactly what did it entail?
Yeah, thanks, Nick. So what's interesting about where I was able to get is you can draw a direct line from a Presidio team project in my capital markets class, fourth semester capital markets class, to this position in the White House, where essentially I started out working on an innovative financial vehicle that we then, the team ended up taking into the real world. We were trying to move it forward in real life beyond just sort of the academic sphere. Through that process, ended up making contact with a current senior policy advisor in the White House, who then ended up getting the title bump to become director of the Office of Social Innovation, is what it's called, within the Domestic Policy Council of the White House. When he got that title bump, he ended up getting in contact with me and asked if I could sort of backfill his old position to become senior policy advisor behind him. So essentially, the line was capital markets team project to setting up a 501c3 nonprofit, to becoming senior policy advisor, and one led right to the next. And it was a pretty magical experience, I have to say, being able to spend roughly 12 months right at the end of the second term of the Obama administration. A lot of people were talking about him being a lame duck at that point, but from an agenda perspective, we were absolutely directed to what he kept saying, run through the tape. And we ended up doing a whole range of really exciting things as the president was trying to cement his environmental and natural resources legacy.
Too cool, I love it. And I want to get back to a little bit of talking about how this transpired, because it's kind of the ideal graduate school story, isn't it? You guys came up with a project, you had a plan, you executed the plan, things started to work, and one thing led to another, and there you were. But just to get back into this, so you joined very close to the end of the administration. But what were you able to, tell me a little bit about what it was like, who were you working with, and what were you able to accomplish during those months that you had to spend in Washington?
Yeah, so I was working for the Council on Environmental Quality, which is a component within the White House. There's a whole number of components working on whether it's science and technology policy, drug control policy, the Office of Management and Budget. I was in the Council on Environmental Quality, and essentially,
what does that mean, a component? Is that like, under a certain cabinet position? What does that mean?
It's basically all of the heads of all of the White House components report directly to Dennis McDonough, at the time the White House Chief of Staff, and essentially what CEQ does is it is the air traffic controller for the various federal agencies that work on natural resources policy. And the reason why you need that air traffic controller within the White House is because natural resources policy is spread out broadly across the executive branch. You have the EPA, you have the Department of the Interior, Department of Agriculture, NOAA, which is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which is within the Department of Commerce, the Army Corps of Engineers, which does water infrastructure, and on and on. So you have a rather broad sort of natural resources policy spread out broadly and horizontally across the federal bureaucracy. CEQ essentially is that air traffic controller to ensure that they're coordinating efforts and moving forward the president's agenda in as coordinated a fashion as is possible.
Got it. So how did it play out for you? Give us a couple examples of things you were helping to coordinate and results that you can point to.
Yeah. So I was the White House lead on conservation finance, I would say. That wasn't my formal title, but that was sort of the de facto title. And essentially what I was trying to do was look at ways to get private capital and ways to have federal policy incentivize bringing in private capital to solve natural resources challenges. So one of the things, for example, I would work on is if the Fish and Wildlife Service within the Department of the Interior was working on a policy to address mitigation, which is a way to bring in private capital. They would have a policy on mitigation, and CEQ would play the role of either providing the incentives or the impetus for Fish and Wildlife Service to actually move forward that policy, or once they actually moved it forward, to review it and provide feedback before it actually is posted in the Federal Register.
And why private capital, and who's private capital? You know, how did that actually play out? Because that's an interesting.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, fundamentally what it is some of the numbers that I've seen thrown around are, you know, to solve the natural resources challenges that we face broadly as a country, we're talking about the need for an investment of $200 billion to $300 billion. And unfortunately, we only, and by we, I mean collectively as a society, only invest, you know, somewhere between 30 and $50 billion, and most all of that comes from the public and the philanthropic sector. And given, you know, looking at sort of the politics of Washington and many states, we're not going to see a big increase in federal or state spending, public sector spending on natural resources conservation anytime soon. And, you know, philanthropy is basically maxed out as well. And so where can we make up that rather sizable gap? It's going to have to come from the private sector. And so the motivation is to basically figure out what are the ways that federal policy can incentivize the injection and the investment of private capital to solve some of these natural resources challenges. And that could be anything from increasing energy efficiency in our vehicle fleet or our building stock. It can be sequestering more carbon in our forests. It can be, or in our agricultural lands. It can be addressing water quality issues, water quantity issues, endangered species habitat. There's a whole number of ways that private capital can sort of help to address natural resources challenges broadly.
But of course, private capital is usually looking for some kind of a return, you know, beyond the existential external return, right? They're looking for something on the bottom line. Is that something you're able to demonstrate?
Yeah, so fundamentally what it comes down to is the monetization of ecosystem services. So, you know, it's a matter of trying to figure out what, by improving a landscape of some kind, or by increasing water quality in a stream, or by driving more energy efficiency in the residential building stock, you need to figure out a way to basically figure out who are the beneficiaries and what are they willing to pay for the improved ecosystem services, whether it's cleaner water, fresher air, sequestered carbon, recreational opportunities in public lands, and on and on. So fundamentally what it comes down to is figuring out ways to monetize ecosystem services. And then that monetization, the cash flows that come out of that improved or preserved ecosystem is what's used to reimburse the investors their principal plus a return.
This is one of my favorite concepts, this idea of ecosystem services, as you described it, monetizing ecosystem services. And it's something that really ought to be quite apolitical. I mean, this is just good business. You're putting some private money behind something, you're accomplishing something good, you're getting a financial return in addition to the, you know, systemic return and the social return, if there were a social component for that matter. Without getting too political, what's your feeling on how this concept is going to survive as we move into the new administration?
Right. Yeah, that's a really
dare I ask.
Yeah, that's a good and timely question. So most of these ecosystem service markets.
I mean, this is really pure capitalism, isn't it? When you really get down and think about it.
It is and it isn't, because a lot of these ecosystem service markets really require a regulatory driver, and some of them do not. So, for example, renewable energy doesn't really require a regulatory driver necessarily, because if you put in a solar farm or a wind farm, there's a natural product that you can sell a marketable product you can sell in the form of kilowatt hours. And so there's a natural cash flow that comes out of that. However, something like a restored wetland or a restored endangered species habitat, it's harder to create a natural market for that. So in order to do so, there needs to be some kind of regulatory driver underneath. And in the case of wetlands, for example, there's the Clean Water Act and our national goal of no net loss of wetlands, which actually was articulated initially by George H.W. Bush. And then the rule, it's called the 2008 rule, which essentially is the driver of the mitigation banking industry, which is really where you see all the private capital coming into restoring wetlands. That was all done under George W. Bush administration. So this is very much a bipartisan concept, the idea of monetizing ecosystem services to benefit society more broadly. But going back to what your initial question is, which is, where do we stand now with the current administration? So all of the concept, at least in the context of wetlands restoration, it all presupposes that we should have a national goal of no net loss of wetlands. And then you have to figure out how to do it, whether you do a more regulatory driver or a more sort of market-based driver. You still have to have that underlying goal. And there are some folks currently in Washington, D.C. that have indicated that they would be okay basically liquidating our natural resources without any intention of restoring them. So if you want to build a golf course in Florida right now, for any detrimental aquatic impacts that you make, you have to mitigate those impacts elsewhere. But if you don't believe that we should have a national goal of no net loss of wetlands, then you would basically just gut the law entirely and let the developers just go willy-nilly through the Everglades. And that's a real source of concern. So while that goal was articulated by a Republican administration and developed further by a subsequent Republican administration, the current administration, as I think anyone who would open up the New York Times or the Washington Post at any point, is outside the realm of what would constitute normal in a lot of different ways in Washington.
Yeah, well, so a little bit of good news in there, at least conceptually. I guess the rest remains to be seen at this point. Take me back to a little bit of the origins of all this, and I just did want to talk a little bit about Presidio and how you wound up there, and kind of how your original project gelled, and just give me a little bit about your Presidio story, how you found out about the school, and your experience there, and how it led to the project that ultimately put this ball in motion for you.
Yeah, so I had spent my entire career, about a decade, in the environmental nonprofit space, and worked primarily on federal policy for environmental nonprofits, and then realized that a big gap in my knowledge base was that I couldn't really speak the language of business. I knew at the highest level what a return on investment was, what an internal rate of return was, but couldn't really speak with any authority in any kind of meetings, and realized that was a big hole in my knowledge base. And so looking around, I was thinking that, I could go sort of join a Wall Street firm and get a couple years worth of experience that way, which would be maybe a little bit challenging and outside of my value set in a lot of ways. I could go get an MBA, would be another way to do it. And I looked around and I was thinking that most MBA programs also would be a little bit outside my value set. And I figured that halfway through the first semester, sort of looking around at my classmates would drive me a little bit bonkers as to where their values are maybe against where mine are. And so, and someone had told me about Presidio, and I immediately thought, wow, that's an MBA program that I could very much, that I would feel at home with, based on my value set, based on where my classmates were going to be, the types of goals, and fundamentally the social and environmental returns that we're all seeking in addition to the financial returns. And so that's how I ended up sort of applying to Presidio, and going through the curriculum. I just never thought that it would eventually lead to a position in the White House. It was it was very, there was a lot of luck, a lot of sort of opportunities that presented themselves that I had the great fortune to be able to pursue based on a whole number of external factors, from support from, my friends and family to the support from the network that Presidio provided me. Yeah, it was a great opportunity.
Terrific. As we have a little bit of time left, I wanted to hear a little bit about the future. We like to try to throw some optimism into the future. That's kind of our raison d'etre, I suppose, even in hard times. Obviously, your job's come to an end. What's next for you? What are you going to try to build into? And then, I guess, a little bit more importantly, what can we all do to help try to, drive what to me feels like a very common sense conversation. Once people understand that things like environmental externalities and some of the ecosystem services that you were referring to are things that actually have a financial component to them, whether that's officially accounted for or not. Once you come to that realization, it feels to me like it starts to make a lot of the regulatory environment very common sense. It makes caring about this stuff and accounting for it as a business really common sense. And I'd be curious where you think that concept is going, and what the rest of us do, folks watching, prospective students, alums, people in business, entrepreneurs out there, can do to continue to advance this conversation.
Yeah, so I think looking at this purely from sort of the policy lens, which is where I come from, where a lot of my background is, I think there's a lot of opportunity, even with the current politics as they are in Washington, because of the way that this is fundamentally a potentially bipartisan approach to natural resources conservation. We're taking advantage of market mechanisms, taking advantage of private capital. In some cases in the mitigation banking world, potentially significantly reducing permitting times. These are all things that sort of the fiscally conservative folks in DC who happen to be in power right now are all very supportive of. So if you can take it out of the frame of, hey, let's do this because we care about endangered species and we care about the quality of our drinking water for our children, or we care about the climate for our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren. If you can take it out of that frame and just purely talk about it in the what's good for the here and now from a fiscal perspective and for the business community, this approach to natural resources conservation can get a lot of traction, I think. So there's some hope there. Which is very beneficial. And then in terms of, what are some things that folks can do? In this space, you can get into the weeds very quickly. So it's hard to say sort of broadly what, folks can do from a community organizing type level or something like that. One thing I would say, and this is going to sound a little bit out of the blue, based on the context of everything so far, is given where we are in the politics of Washington D.C., and sort of the cultural expectations in the digital age is we expect to get our information for free, but the reality is having the sort of the investigative journalism that is required in 2017 America, that is an expensive endeavor. And you can't get that information. You can't basically expect to constantly be getting that type of information for free. And so one thing I would say, and this is, again, coming out of left field a little bit.
Well, this hits home. I hear you. Yeah,
I would say buy your subscription to the New York Times. Buy a subscription to the Washington Post, the New Yorker, ProPublica, Vox, etc. And don't expect to get that news for free, because the way, the direction that journalism is going, we're going to lose a lot of the hard-hitting investigative journalism that we have, that basically is fundamental to a healthy and functioning democracy.
Yeah. Well said. And finally, how about for yourself? What's next? What's the next step?
Yeah, so if looking in this space of conservation finance, if you sort of do a landscape analysis, you see that there right now is a glut of private capital in the marketplace, and not a lot of investable deals for that to dry up some of that capital or to soak up some of that capital. And it's a very interesting time that we're in. Part of the reason for that glut of capital is because right now we're seeing the largest transfer. The largest wealth transfer really in the history of the world, where baby boomers are sort of transferring their wealth down to the millennial generation. Baby boomers, for the most part, were pretty agnostic investors. The millennials and Gen Xers are more looking to do good and do well. They want their investment to not just provide financial returns, but also social and environmental returns. So having this excess capital in the marketplace means that there needs to be a lot of investable deals. And at a very high scale. But the problem is we don't see that. And so the capital's sitting on the sidelines right now. And so what I would like to do very much is to basically get my hands dirty and do the deal development work to basically create scalable market rate deals in the natural resources conservation space. So deals that basically where private capital can be used to clean water, to provide endangered species habitat, to restore wetlands, to increase energy efficiency, etc. I'm a little bit more agnostic on what the actual intervention is, as much as what I'm more interested in is the scalability and the investability of the actual financial vehicle, and basically being able to attract, not just a few $1 million here and a few $1 million there in a pilot scale, but actually really ramping up and getting institutional investors interested. So, hundreds of millions of dollars and even billions of dollars of investment.
Mm-hmm. David, thanks a million for joining us. We most definitely hope to follow along as progress is made on everything that you just described, and we certainly hope you'll keep in touch with us. This is definitely the kind of stuff we hope to be covering in the future at Triple Pundit. And I know that anybody watching this video is going to be excited about that too, be they existing Presidio alums or friends of Presidio, prospective students, and so on. So without further ado, thanks a million. We look forward to sharing this video, and thanks a ton for your time.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Cheers.